Look at him, 40 years old and still can't keep his own woman loyal. The words slammed into me like a thrown beer bottle, shattering not just in sound but in the laughter that followed. And as I stood frozen in the middle of the banquet hall with strings of cheap fairy lights buzzing overhead and coworkers smirking into their whiskey glasses, I caught the eyes of the one person I'd begged God not to let see me like this, my teenage son, Tyler, whose face flushed scarlet as if he'd been struck too. And in that instant humiliation burrowed deeper than any knife, because pride was supposed to be the last shield a father could give his boy. Yet mine had been stripped away in front of 100 witnesses who now pretended not to stare while secretly feeding on the spectacle, and before anyone else could fill the silence, I forced a grin sharp enough to cut my own tongue and muttered, "Funny thing about secrets, they usually cut deeper when you don't see them coming." A line that sounded casual but carried the weight of the one advantage nobody in that room knew I held, a detail I wouldn't reveal until it was too late for them to stop me. And maybe I should back up to tell you who's speaking. My name's Daniel Carter. I'm 42 years old, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, and I've been ambitious enough to sacrifice sleep, weekends, and parts of myself I can't get back just to keep a roof over my family. But right now, none of that mattered because the woman I loved, Melissa, the woman I defended in every argument, had her hand locked around the wrist of my oldest friend, Brent Lawson. Their bodies leaning too close at the edge of the dance floor, her engagement ring my ring glinting under the lights like a cruel little spotlight, and for reasons I can't explain, all I could think about was the pecan pie her mother baked every Thanksgiving, the same pie Melissa once told me symbolized tradition, loyalty, and the sweetness worth waiting for. And the sight of her licking frosting off Brent's finger at my company's holiday party made that pie taste like ashes in my memory. And if you've never been the butt of a joke in front of people you secretly wanted respect from, you don't know the crawling heat that burns up your neck or the way your hands twitch for violence while your brain screams for composure. Because one wrong move and they don't just laugh at your pain, they define you by it. So I stood there listening to Brent say, "Guess loyalty's not on the menu tonight." And the sound of ice rattling in glasses and a few nervous coughs sharpened the humiliation until my mouth was full of metal, and when Melissa turned those mascara-heavy eyes on me and whispered, "Don't make a scene, Daniel," I almost laughed because the scene had already been written, cast, and performed. My role wasn't to control it anymore, but to survive it. Though even survival felt like surrender, and the only thing I knew with certainty as the room tilted with judgment was that this night would not end the way they thought, because humiliation is gasoline. And somewhere deep in my chest, a spark was already waiting to catch fire. The spark caught when Brent leaned close enough for me to smell the bourbon on his breath. His grin tilted in that cocky way he used to flash when we were teenagers sneaking into bars with fake IDs. Except now it carried the smugness of a man who thought he'd already claimed victory, and the crowd, eager for another line, leaned in as though the party had turned into a stage play, each of them buying tickets with their silence, waiting to see how far my dignity would unravel before it snapped. And I swear I could hear Tyler breathing fast behind me, the sound of my son's shame louder than the music, louder than the glasses clinking, louder even than my own pulse. So when Brent whispered, "Guess she finally realized who the real man is," I tilted my head like I hadn't heard him right, though every syllable was carved into me like a hot brand, and I replied low enough that only he and Melissa caught it, "You'll choke on those words when the lights aren't so bright." And the way Melissa's eyes darted nervously told me she understood there was something buried beneath my restraint, something she had never seen in me before, and that flicker of fear in her expression fueled me more than whiskey ever could. Because the truth was I had built my entire adult life like a scaffolding of controlled career ladders, climbed rung by rung, bills paid late but never skipped, sacrifices made so my family could look middle class enough to blend. And if anyone thought I was going to crumble in front of coworkers who whispered behind cubicles about layoffs and promotions, they had no idea that survival had already carved calluses over my pride. Yet even calluses can bleed when pressed too hard, and as my boss, Mr. Harper, cleared his throat like he was about to intervene, I saw in his eyes the calculation of a man deciding whether I was still leadership material or just another liability, and that tiny hesitation drove home the point. Tonight wasn't just about Melissa and Brent. It was about whether the name Daniel Carter would forever be synonymous with weakness. So I smiled, not because I found anything funny, but because control can look a lot like madness if you hold it tight enough, and I turned toward the bar, each step echoing against the polished floor, the muttering behind me swelling like storm clouds, and as I wrapped my hand around a glass of black coffee, yes, coffee at a holiday party, The one habit my colleagues mocked me for because I said it kept me grounded. I thought about how every betrayal in life feels like someone spitting in your cup, and the trick is deciding whether to drink it or throw it in their face. And though my body shook with the urge to smash the glass across Brent's jaw, I forced a swallow, bitter as dirt, because restraint is sometimes the most terrifying weapon in the room. And when I set the empty cup down, I knew the moment wasn't over. It was only sharpening, because Tyler was still watching, Melissa was still whispering into Brent's ear, and the night hadn't yet bled me dry. The bitterness still burned in my throat when I turned back and caught the smirk Brent thought he was hiding, the kind of smirk that says I own the room now, and maybe he did in that instant because people gravitate toward spectacle the way moths dive into porch lights, but what he didn't see was the way my fingers had stopped trembling. Steadied by the realization that humiliation only stings if you let it end you, and I wasn't finished, not by a long shot, so I walked back toward the dance floor, hearing shoes shuffle as if people expected me to swing, and when I stopped in front of Melissa, her perfume cheap vanilla, the kind she wore in college when she was still the girl who believed in my half-broken pickup truck, hit me like nostalgia wrapped in poison, and I asked, loud enough for the front row of gawkers to hear, was the ring too small, or was the man too ordinary? And her silence cracked louder than a gunshot, because the Melissa I knew always had an answer ready. But Brent jumped in with a cocky, she just got tired of waiting for you to catch up, and I could hear phones buzzing, see the glow of cameras lifted like fireflies in the dim, and it hit me then that this wasn't just a private humiliation anymore, it was being uploaded, recorded, stamped into the digital bloodstream where coworkers and strangers alike would chew on my ruin. And the thought might have buckled me, if not for the fact that I knew something they didn't, a thread I'd been pulling quietly for weeks, something small but lethal that would unravel both Melissa and Brent. When the time was right, so I tilted my head, forced a grin, and said, funny, Brent. You always were good at running plays someone else drew up. A jab sharp enough that a few guys from accounting laughed nervously, and the flicker of doubt in Brent's eyes reminded me that no matter how loud a crowd gets, a whisper of truth can still cut through it. But before he could reply, my boss's wife, Diane, swooped in with her sugar-sweet drawl, saying, now boys, let's not ruin Christmas with all this drama. And the crowd chuckled like she'd defused a bomb, but I knew better, she'd only pressed pause, and in that silence my mind flashed to Tyler again, his jaw clenched, his phone half raised like he might capture this mess, or maybe just text someone that his father was crumbling, and I felt a surge of heat so fierce it almost buckled my knees. But instead I straightened, looked around the room, and told myself what I never dared say out loud. The first blow isn't the end of the fight, it's the opening bell, and as the music stuttered back to life and Melissa tugged Brent toward the exit, I realized the real performance hadn't even begun. The music thumped back on like nothing had happened, but every beat felt like a countdown echoing in my skull as Melissa dragged Brent toward the lobby doors, her heels clicking sharp as gunfire across the polished floor, and I caught the ripple of whispers following them like a toxic tide, coworkers leaning into one another with grins that said this night had just become their Monday morning story, and I couldn't let it end there because humiliation thrives in silence, it fattens itself on retreat. So I shoved through the cluster of gawkers, the scent of cologne, perfume, and overpoured whiskey clinging to my clothes as I followed them out, not caring that my son trailed behind me, his sneakers squeaking in awkward rhythm, and when I hit the cold December air, headlights from idling Ubers slashed across Melissa's face just as she turned and snapped, Daniel, stop embarrassing yourself, her voice carrying enough scorn to slice me in two. But instead of bleeding, I felt a strange calm settle, the kind that only comes when you've been stripped bare and realize there's nothing left for them to take. And I shot back. You did that the second you kissed him where everyone could see. And Brent laughed, low and smug, like a man sure he'd already won, muttering, you really don't get it, do you? And I could feel Tyler stiffen beside me, torn between running and fighting. So I locked eyes with Brent and said, no, I get it better than you think. And that's why you should be worried. Planting the seed I knew would fester, because the advantage I carried wasn't fists or rage, but something quieter, something I tucked away weeks ago when late nights at the office started smelling of lies. And the way Melissa's brow furrowed told me she suspected I wasn't bluffing. Though Brent just tightened his grip on her arm like possession alone proved strength. And in that moment I felt the urge to laugh, not because any of this was funny, but because humiliation has a way of sharpening your sight, making every flicker of weakness in your enemy glow like neon. And Brent had plenty, starting with the way his hand twitched when I mentioned worry, like a quarterback fumbling the snap, and as a black SUV pulled up, Melissa shot me one last look. Not of triumph, but of calculation, the kind of glance a gambler gives before flipping a card. And I knew right then the game had only just started because her silence was a tell. And I'd spent my whole life studying the tells of people who thought they were better than me. Her eyes lingered on me longer than I expected, not in affection but in the cool arithmetic of someone weighing odds. And that flash of recognition, that she still didn't know how much I'd already seen, was almost enough to warn me against the bitter December air. But Tyler's voice cracked through it with a tremor that cut deeper than her betrayal. "Dad, let's just go home." And hearing my son plead in front of Brent, in front of Melissa, felt like being asked to bow while the crowd watched, so I steadied my tone and said, "We will, son, but not like this." Though even as I said it, I could feel the weight of everything stacked against me, the mortgage hovering like a guillotine, the rumors about layoffs at the office, the whispered comparisons at family dinners where my brother-in-law bragged about his vacation homes, while I quietly calculated credit card balances under the table, and in that swirl of inadequacy, Brent stepped closer, his breath frosting in the cold as he hissed, "Face it, Carter. You've lost job, woman, respect. All of it." And the casual cruelty in his voice almost made me snap, but instead I leaned in just enough to say, "You're confusing tonight with the endgame, because humiliation in public burns hottest when you refuse to play your assigned role." And the way his smirk faltered told me the uncertainty had lodged under his skin, and Melissa, sensing it, squeezed his arm like she was steadying him more than clinging, which made me wonder if she'd already glimpsed the cracks I was about to split wide open. And when a group of younger coworkers spilled out of the party behind us, their laughter sharp and careless, one of them muttered, "Damn, this is better than Netflix," and I wanted to vanish, wanted to drag Tyler away from the spectacle. But pride kept my boots planted, because sometimes survival isn't about escaping fire but about standing in the flames long enough that everyone else realizes you're not burning. And as Brent guided Melissa into the SUV, his voice lifted loud enough for the onlookers to hear, "Guess he'll just be crying into his black coffee tomorrow." The cheap jab at my one harmless habit landing like a slap. And though people laughed, it didn't sting the way it should have, because in my head I was already thinking about the folder tucked away on my laptop, the screenshots, the receipts, the overlooked messages that neither of them knew I'd collected. And while the SUV door slammed shut, muffling Melissa's silhouette behind tinted glass, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. Tyler texting me even though he stood beside me, and when I glanced at the screen, the words read, "Tell me you're not letting them get away with this." And for the first time all night, I felt something close to strength return. I stared at the glowing screen, my son's words burning brighter than the streetlights, and for a second I wanted to crumble into the snow-dusted curb, confess that I had no fight left. But then I caught my reflection in the SUV window before it pulled away. And the man staring back wasn't beaten, he was calculating. Eyes narrowed the way they used to get when I studied game film in high school football, scanning for the weak spot in the opponent's defense. And as the car's taillights dissolved into the dark, I shoved my phone back into my pocket and told Tyler, "I'm not done," though my voice cracked enough to betray the weight pressing down on me, and he just nodded, shoulders squared like he'd been waiting to hear it all along. And when we stepped back inside the party, the warmth of the room didn't touch me. Instead, it magnified the divide, every laugh, every sideways glance slicing like invisible razors, yet I forced myself to move through it, shaking hands with men who avoided my eyes, pretending to smile at women whispering behind their manicured fingers, because walking out would have been surrender, and surrender was blood in the water. So I kept my posture tall and let the humiliation settle into my bones like an infection I planned to weaponize later, and when Mr. Harper clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Daniel, maybe call it a night, son," I gave him the kind of polite nod that hides a storm, replying, "Appreciate the concern, sir, but I've got loose ends to tie up first." A line vague enough to pass as resignation, yet sharp enough to make him glance twice, and in that moment I realized I'd shifted something. The pitying looks became wary ones, as though the crowd sensed I wasn't folding but loading a chamber, and maybe they couldn't name it. But the sudden hush when I walked past the bar told me they felt it, the way animals feel thunder before it hits. And as I poured myself another cup of bitter coffee, the warmth searing down my throat, I thought of my father, a factory man who used to say, "Son, the best revenge is letting people think they've got you cornered right until you show them the wall's just a door." And for the first time in years I believed him, because tonight the door was already cracked. and I had my hand on the handle, ready to swing it open when they least expected it. The party wound down in fragments, half-drunk coworkers fumbling for coats, the DJ packing up wires while muttering about his Venmo, the janitor sweeping glitter like he was burying the night under dust. And yet I stayed, anchored to that coffee cup like it was the only tether keeping me upright, because leaving before everyone else meant Brent and Melissa's story would dominate unchecked. And I couldn't allow their version to cement before mine began, so when Harper pulled me aside near the exit, his tie loosened, his cologne souring under sweat, he said quietly, "Daniel, I've seen men break in this job, but don't let tonight be your legacy." And though it sounded like advice, I heard it for what it was. A verdict, and maybe even a warning that my promotion, the one I'd been grinding toward for 2 years, was now hanging by a thread as fragile as the garland drooping above us. So I answered carefully, "Funny thing about legacies, sir, they're only written once the truth comes out." And the way his brows pinched told me I'd planted doubt, the first of many seeds I'd scatter before this was over, and when I finally stepped into the icy parking lot, the air smelled like exhaust and snow, a bitter cocktail that sharpened my senses, and I slid into my old Ford truck. Tyler climbing in beside me without a word, his silence both an accusation and a strange sort of faith. And as the heater sputtered to life, my phone buzzed again. This time not from him, but from a group chat notification I wasn't supposed to be in. One Melissa had created with her friends, except she'd forgotten months ago that I was still silently included after borrowing my phone for directions. And there, glowing under the dim dome light, was her message from earlier that evening. "Wait until you see his face, he's going to implode in front of everyone." Followed by Brent's reply, "Record it." This will be priceless. And though rage flooded me, what burned brighter was the gift they'd handed me. Digital proof of intent. Ammunition disguised as mockery, and I felt a slow, dangerous smile crawl across my face because humiliation, once documented, can flip directions like a current, and now I held the wire that would electrocute them both. I left the parking lot without a word, letting the truck's heater sputter against the cold that gnawed at my fingers, and as Tyler fiddled with the radio, trying to find something familiar, a classic Eagles track or maybe a podcast about sports stats, I felt the weight of the screenshots burning in my pocket, each message a spark ready to ignite a fire that neither Brent nor Melissa could contain. And the irony wasn't lost on me. Their own digital vanity had handed me the leverage I needed. The kind of leverage that didn't require yelling, throwing objects, or public confrontation. Because power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent, invisible, and waiting to snap. And I thought about the pecan pie again. The one Melissa's mother baked every Thanksgiving, symbol of loyalty and tradition, and how sweet it had seemed then compared to the bitterness I now tasted every time I remembered Brent laughing in front of Tyler, and my mind mapped the steps carefully, calculating social currents, timing, and the perfect moment when embarrassment could be turned back on them, in a way that was complete, inescapable, and almost artistic. And as I pulled onto the highway, the headlights cutting through fresh snow, I rehearsed my words in my head like a quarterback running drills, careful, precise, knowing every gesture mattered, because tonight was no longer just about proving I wasn't a fool, was about proving they were predators who had underestimated the prey, and prey can be patient, almost frighteningly, so when they have a plan. And as I glanced at Tyler, quietly scrolling through his phone, I realized he sensed it too, that quiet electricity in the air that meant a reckoning was coming, and when I parked outside my apartment, the smell of roasting coffee beans from the nearby diner drifting faintly through the cold, I didn't unload my anger yet. Instead, I wrote down every small detail. Brent's gestures, Melissa's whispers, the timing of the chat messages, the laughter, the looks exchanged, and even the glances of bystanders who could unknowingly serve as witnesses in the right moment. And the act of cataloging it gave me a strange calm, as if I was collecting thunderclouds in a jar, waiting for the perfect storm. And when I finally went inside, the familiar warmth of the kitchen hit me, coffee on the counter, Tyler's favorite mug waiting, and I realized the juxtaposition made the plan even sweeter. The mundane, comforting symbols of normal life juxtaposed against the chaos I was about to orchestrate. And as I sipped the dark liquid, bitter and grounding, I thought, every betrayal carries its own map to justice. You just have to be willing to read it carefully, and the words felt like a whisper directly to Brent and Melissa, even though they were miles away, oblivious to the trap closing around them. The next morning I woke to the low hum of the city outside my window, headlights casting lines across the blinds, and even though the apartment smelled like stale coffee and toast crumbs, I felt a pulse of anticipation, a thrill that coursed through me like electricity, because the first moves had been set, and now it was only a matter of timing, and Tyler, who was now half-dressed for school, gave me a quick glance that carried both fear and excitement, and I nodded once, silently conveying, "Trust the plan," and when I opened my laptop, the folder of evidence glowed like a treasure chest. Brent and Melissa's own words and images arranged carefully in folders named by date and offense, digital breadcrumbs leading straight to the truth, and I crafted a text for Melissa that seemed casual on the surface. "Coffee later? I need to discuss something important." Subtext heavy enough that she would read panic into it without realizing she'd already walked into my design, and as I hit send, I felt the thrill of control tighten in my chest, because the genius of revenge is in the patience, in the subtle accumulation of pressure until the victim collapses under their own weight, and I poured myself a cup of coffee, dark as midnight, swirling it like molten steel, and Brent's face flashed in my mind, his arrogance now a fuel I could channel, and as the morning traffic crawled past, I rehearsed every exchange, every look, every phrase, imagining the humiliation mirrored back on them, and when the ding of a received message came back almost immediately, Melissa typing with that nervy little hesitation that always preceded mistakes, I smiled quietly because the trap was alive, humming in the veins of digital reality, and the irony was delicious. She had created the group chat, thinking she was hidden, thinking I wouldn't notice. And now it was going to be her undoing, every emoji and laughing gif, a nail in the coffin. And as I glanced at Tyler helping with his backpack, I realized the world outside would never know the depth of calculation that goes into balancing family, career, and vengeance all at once, and yet the rush of satisfaction, the quiet certainty that justice would land perfectly, made every sacrifice I had endured, the layoffs I'd weathered, the nights staring at bills, the hollow congratulations of coworkers, feel like preparation, as if life itself had been arranging this moment, and when Melissa walked in later, the air thick with the scent of vanilla and faint perfume, her eyes widening the second she saw my laptop open with the chat thread visible, I knew she recognized too late the small details she'd ignored. The tiny social clues, the overlooked permissions, the simple arrogance of assuming she was untouchable, and the realization in her eyes beer. Unadulterated panic was the first chord of the symphony I had composed in silence, while Brent's phone buzzed with a notification that spelled disaster. And the moment hung there, taut and electric, a curtain about to lift, because the trap had been set, the noose tightened, and the first flinch of fear had already taken hold. Melissa's gasp sliced the room like a siren, her eyes flicking between the open laptop and Brent, whose smugness had dissolved into panic, the color draining from his face as he realized the screenshots, the messages, the timestamps, everything they thought was private had been cataloged, organized, and I sat back in my chair, swirling my coffee slowly, feeling the burn of its bitterness anchor me in the calm before the storm, while Tyler leaned against the counter, wide-eyed, witnessing a justice long overdue, and I thought about the pecan pie again, how sweet and comforting it once was. And now how symbolic its absence felt in this moment, the small reminder of promises broken, traditions trampled, and loyalty discarded. And I whispered under my breath, almost to myself, "You can't hide the truth in plain sight, no matter how pretty it looks," a line that could double as a proverb, and Brent stammered, "Daniel, I can explain." But the words were weak, feeble, and the power had shifted irrevocably, because every smile, every laugh, every careless text now pointed directly at them, like arrows in a tableau of their own making, and Melissa's voice, trembling, said, "You wouldn't dare," though the truth in my eyes made her realize I already had, and the thrill wasn't in cruelty, but in symmetry. Poetic justice finally catching up to arrogance, and when I hit play on a short screen recording from the group chat, their faces mirrored the humiliation they'd orchestrated. Brent's jaw tightening, Melissa's mascara running in streaks from frantic blinking, and Tyler whispered, almost reverently, "That's perfect." The youngest witness to a carefully measured reckoning, while I reminded myself, silently, that revenge isn't just exposure, it's the slow, precise turning of every weakness into consequence. And as the notifications pinged Brent's phone, showing the group chat forwarding itself to colleagues and family who had no idea of the private theater they were about to witness, I felt a surge of grim satisfaction, tempered by exhaustion, the culmination of months spent planning, documenting, and waiting, and then Melissa lunged forward, trying to delete the thread, swipe the evidence, but her fingers froze mid-air because of a technicality I had anticipated, an overlooked permission setting, the small oversight that made the trap unbreakable. And Brent cursed under his breath, realizing that the very hubris that had made him post, record, and laugh had now turned into a self-immolation. And I leaned back, sipped my coffee, and thought, sometimes life gives you the receipts you need. You just have to be patient enough to collect them, as the two people who had shattered my pride now squirmed under the weight of their own recklessness, their every attempt to explain, justify, or erase, only adding fuel to the wildfire of social and emotional exposure I had orchestrated. And just as they began to grasp the immensity of their downfall, Tyler's phone buzzed, another unintended witness forwarding screenshots to mutual friends, and I realized with a small, grim smile that the second twist was already in motion. One that neither Melissa nor Brent had the imagination or patience to anticipate. Brent's face twisted in disbelief, the kind of expression a man gets when he finally sees a hurricane coming straight for his front porch and realizes there's no evacuation plan, and Melissa, trembling, tried to plead, "Daniel, please." But the words were drowned out by the sound of her own messages pinging in rapid succession, every notification a nail sealing the coffin they had built themselves, and I watched them flail, not with glee but with the grim satisfaction of someone who knows fairness has finally arrived, because betrayal carries its own echo, and tonight that echo had come home, and Tyler, standing beside me, whispered, "I can't believe you did this." And I let him think the shock was directed at me, when really it was aimed at the messy symmetry of justice unfolding. The poetic irony of coffee cups and pecan pie ghosts, haunting them in the most American domestic way, while Brent's phone buzzed with screenshots already shared with family, friends, and coworkers who had no context. And Melissa's attempts to delete, block, or spin the narrative fell apart against a minor social technicality I had discovered weeks ago, a subtle digital loophole that ensured nothing could disappear, and I realized in that moment that humiliation, when executed with precision, is both weapon and lesson. And as Brent muttered, You're insane," I caught the flicker of fear, that raw, human fear that comes only when someone finally sees the consequences of their own arrogance, and it struck me how far we underestimate the quiet ones, the men who drink bitter coffee, who stand too long in the snow, who document every little slight, because patience, in my experience, is more terrifying than rage. And Melissa's voice cracked again, this time trembling with realization rather than defiance. "All of this, I can't." And the room felt heavy, saturated with the weight of exposure, and I spoke softly, almost like a mantra. Truth always has a way of tipping the scales, sometimes through fury, sometimes through small, unnoticed details, but it always balances. A line I knew would echo in Brent's and Melissa's minds long after the moment, and as Tyler handed me my own coffee, warm and grounding, I realized the final layer of the twist was already unfurling. The social ripple, the group chat forwarded again by a friend Tyler, had messaged, ensuring their public embarrassment would circulate further, faster, and deeper than they could ever contain. And in that precise moment, watching two people who once seemed untouchable crumble under the weight of their own actions, I felt a clarity so sharp it cut through months of rage, sleepless nights, and heartache, because the lesson was no longer theoretical. Betrayal exacts its own cost, patience magnifies it, and the world has a way of amplifying small truths until they become unstoppable forces. And as I raised my cup, sipping slowly, I realized that while scars would remain, so too would wisdom, the hard, bitter, utterly American kind that comes from surviving, observing, and finally claiming the justice life somehow handed you when you refused to flinch. The room fell into an almost surreal silence, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic outside and the faint hiss of the heater, and I could see Brent slumping into the nearest chair, shoulders heavy with a weight he had spent months ignoring, while Melissa's hands shook as she scrolled frantically through her own phone, realizing every attempt at control had been anticipated, cataloged, and neutralized. And in that moment, I didn't feel triumph or vengeance in the shallow sense. I felt completion, a rare, quiet clarity that comes when the universe seems to fold neatly the chaos you've endured into symmetry. And Tyler, standing beside me, finally smiled, small and knowing. The kind of smile that says, someone has learned more about justice in an afternoon than most people do in decades. And I thought about the pecan pie. Again, its flaky crust and sticky sweetness, now a ghost of trust, broken and rebuilt in principle. a domestic symbol transformed into a moral compass, while my coffee, bitter and grounding, reminded me that endurance often tastes unpleasant before it delivers clarity. And as I met Melissa's gaze one last time, she whispered, defeated, I didn't know. And I said softly, that's the thing about betrayal, it tells you exactly who someone is before they even realize it themselves. A line I knew she would carry forever, the kind that sits like cold iron in your chest, teaching lessons without need for further argument. And Brent, muttering under his breath, glanced at the notifications still flooding his phone and realized the ripple effect couldn't be undone. And I allowed myself a brief, ironic laugh, thinking how poetic it was that a simple digital oversight, a tiny unchecked permission, had toppled their carefully constructed arrogance, because in life, it is often the overlooked details that carry the heaviest consequences. And I took a slow sip of coffee, warm against the cold sting of justice, and whispered to Tyler, remember this, patience isn't passive. Observation isn't weakness, and the truth, well, the truth has a way of catching up to everyone. A line both quiet and monumental. And as we stepped out into the snowy night, headlights glinting on ice, I felt the weight of the ordeal settle into scars that would never fully fade, yet also into a hard-won wisdom that made me feel, against every instinct, to collapse under betrayal, undeniably alive, because life will hand you storms, people will fail you, and sometimes the world itself conspires to humiliate, but in those moments of careful observation, strategic patience, and relentless integrity, you can bend the chaos into something just poetic, and if you're careful, even beautiful. And I realized then that the ultimate revenge isn't cruelty, it's clarity. You survive, you endure, and you let the truth do the work. While walking away with the scars and the coffee to prove you've lived, learned, and finally claimed your own story. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.